With over 1.22 million casualties and the toll continuing to climb, Russia is paying a steep price for every yard of ground seized in Ukraine. Yet Moscow shows no signs of halting its advance. The year 2026 is poised to bring more offensives, more deaths, and further devastation, much of it self-inflicted on Russia itself. Ukraine's robust defensive lines have already given Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin inner circle cause for serious concern. When Russian forces rely on the attritional tactic of throwing more troops into the meat grinder without meaningful innovation, Kyiv is gearing up to shift the war's momentum. Putin cannot stop what is coming for one straightforward reason: Ukraine is transitioning to the offensive. Comment number 1 if you support Ukraine, number 2 if you support Russia, and number 3 if you love peace.
Lock the Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief, Alexander Syrskyi. The time has arrived for Ukraine to deliver powerful strikes against Russia, as Moscow will not voluntarily end the brutal war Putin unleashed. In an interview with LB.UA, cited by RBC Ukraine, Syrskyi stated, "All attack directions remain the same as before. Only the timing, quantity of equipment, and personnel change. Everything else stays the same. They are sticking to their plan." The message to Ukrainians and their allies is unmistakable. Despite talk of peace, Putin's true aim is to erase Ukraine from the map. However, Russia's planned assaults may not unfold as the Kremlin intends, even before Ukraine fully alters its strategy. The reasons will become clear shortly.
Returning to Syrskyi's remarks, the Ukrainian commander-in-chief emphasized that a strong offensive is as vital as a solid defense, and Ukraine will apply this mindset in 2026. He explained, "We will conduct a strategic defensive campaign, but we understand that victory cannot be achieved through defense alone. Therefore, we will carry out offensive operations to maintain operational initiative." This scenario represents a nightmare for Russia. The Kremlin once hoped Ukraine would simply hunker down and defend, as that would be the ideal path for Putin, allowing thousands of Russian troops to be sacrificed until Ukrainian lines finally cracked. But Ukraine recognizes this attrition strategy clearly and has declared enough is enough. Now is the moment to strike back. Once again, as in the summer of 2023, lessons must be drawn from that setback. Before delving into those lessons, the key question is, why now? Two primary factors stand out. Ukraine is better prepared than ever for this type of warfare, and Russia has weakened to the point where it may lack the strength to block Ukrainian gains.
Focusing first on Ukraine, Syrskyi himself highlighted one reason for launching more attacks in 2026, noting that no nation wins a war through defense alone. Yet offensives without sound strategy are reckless. For Syrskyi, such operations become feasible in 2026, thanks to the restructuring of the Ukrainian armed forces, transforming the army into a far more formidable adversary for Russian troops. Consider Ukraine's corps-level reforms. Throughout the war with Russia, Ukraine needed to establish corps formations, as pre-invasion structures were not fully prepared as desired. According to Syrskyi, this process is nearly complete, shifting the military from ad hoc organization and management to a professional, far more lethal system for Russia. On the corps reform, Syrskyi said, "This helps us reduce the burden on the management system."
Previously, the management system was built on temporary structures, operational tactical groups. Military personnel and officers were appointed on rotation for limited periods. They were detached from their primary positions, which affected management quality. The Ukrainian military is now leaner organizationally, enabling faster decisions by commanders and more precise execution by troops.
Specifically, Syrskyi noted that Syrskyi now controls a fixed number of brigades, all operating under unified command.
This restructuring delivers higher deployment and support efficiency, according to the Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief, and the result for Russia could prove catastrophic. While work remains as brigades transition to new formations, Siersky affirmed that Ukraine expects to complete the final pieces of this organizational puzzle this year.
What observers have seen in Ukraine over recent months illustrates the offensive implications of these reforms. The failed 2023 summer counteroffensive has been referenced, and Siersky and his team have drawn lessons from its mistakes. Less reported in mainstream outlets toward the end of 2025, however, is that Ukraine devoted significant effort to small-scale counterattacks, rolling back many Russian gains. Consider the city of Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast's Donbas region.
Throughout much of 2025, Russian forces attempted to encircle Pokrovsk. Surrounding settlements fell under occupation, and Moscow began infiltrating troops into Pokrovsk itself to establish footholds for a multi-axis assault on the city. Ukraine has not yet expelled Russia from Pokrovsk, far from it, as every yard of the war-ravaged city remains a fierce battleground. But what Ukraine accomplished was a series of counterattacks that dramatically slowed Russian momentum, preventing Putin from achieving his objectives, first seizing Pokrovsk by summer, then by mid-November. Pokrovsk holds firm. A major factor was that in the second half of 2025, Ukraine executed what amounted to a test version of the plan it intends to apply against Russia in 2026.
Siersky himself reported a series of counterattacks in the Dobropilya direction within the Pokrovsk sector of Donetsk Oblast, which became the focus of Ukrainian efforts from late August to October 2025, liberating substantial territory. Siersky stated, "As a result, our units split the enemy's assault group and liberated over 166 square miles north of Pokrovsk. Russian casualties exceeded 13,000 killed and wounded. What unfolded in the second half of 2025 marked the formative phase of a new strategy. Ukraine is now fully committed to it for one simple reason: it works."
As Ukraine prepares its new approach for 2026, combining staunch defense with fresh offensive waves, Russia finds itself in a difficult position. This brings us to the second reason for Ukraine's shift, as noted earlier. Much of the territory Russia captured in 2025 stands ripe for liberation in 2026. Several factors contribute, starting with Russia's minuscule territorial gains relative to staggering manpower losses across Donetsk Oblast. On January 17th, Grace Maps and Katerina Stepanenko wrote in the New York Post, underscoring this point. The authors highlighted NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's statement that Putin's forces suffered 20,000 to 25,000 killed per month for minimal advances in Ukraine. Yet by mid-December, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reported actual Russian monthly deaths nearing 30,000. Remember, these are fatalities alone, not including the wounded who add to the overall casualty burden, and that will become a major issue for Russia shortly. Regardless of the precise figure, even the lower estimate of 20,000 per month spells disaster for Russia, both operationally and in terms of perception. According to Britannica, the former Soviet Union lost roughly 15,000 troops over a decade-long conflict that ultimately ended in failure for Moscow. Now, Putin sacrifices at least 5,000 troops monthly, surpassing the total casualties of that entire war. If Zelensky's numbers hold, he could be losing twice the Soviet-Afghan war fatalities each month on Ukraine's drone-saturated battlefields. And for what? Mappis and Stepanenko noted gains of roughly 0.386 square miles per 93 casualties throughout 2025. This casualty-to-terrain ratio remains consistent with prior years.
But a major difference has emerged. Previously, Russia offset massive losses through large-scale recruitment drives, offering generous payments to throw mercenaries into Ukrainian defenses. That is no longer straightforward.
Russia cannot replace troops quickly enough, and its forces in Ukraine are weakening to the point where Syrski's referenced counterattacks become more viable than ever. The decline in Russian recruitment began in 2025 per Mates and Stepanenko. The authors wrote, "Russian recruitment is struggling to offset soldier losses." According to the Kremlin, Russia recruited 406,000 personnel in 2025, while Ukrainian estimates show casualties exceeding 410,000 over the past year. That already reflects an annual shortfall of roughly 4,000 troops, but the picture is incomplete.
As seen in Ukraine's counterattacks, the second half of 2025 marked the true turning point, when high Russian casualty rates combined with recruitment shortfalls created a lethal mix. By October 2025, the Kyiv Post reported Russia's recruitment campaign losing steam despite record bonuses for anyone willing to sign up for Putin's failing Ukraine invasion. The outlet quoted Russian recruiters, quote, "Everyone who wanted to make money from the war has already signed up," end quote, posing a severe problem for the Kremlin entering 2026. If promises of bonuses up to $39,300 plus escalating payments fail to lure Russians into the fight, Putin edges closer to full mobilization, a step he has long avoided. That decision could prove inevitable and spark discontent severe enough to deliver a final blow to his Ukraine ambitions.
On January 8th, Al Jazeera reported on Russia's current recruitment status. Numbers remain high, with Moscow planning to average 34,083 recruits monthly in 2026. But the issue is whether this suffices. Both Zelensky and Syrski reported Russian December losses between 33,000 and 35,000, confirmed via video evidence alone. The takeaway is clear. Russian military death rates are so high that the Kremlin cannot replenish fast enough. This is a decline Ukraine has engineered with lethal precision, setting the stage for the 2026 offensive shift Syrski described.
Even if sufficient funds could recruit the needed troops, the Kremlin faces additional hurdles. 2026 may mark the year Russia's economic wheels finally come off. Mates and Stepanenko highlighted the impact of Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russian refineries and energy infrastructure. In November 2025 alone, roughly 10% of Russia's refining capacity went offline, the authors noted. December saw at least 24 attacks on Russian oil assets and infrastructure, a record that Ukraine's persistent long-range drone and missile strikes are unlikely to leave unbroken. Russia is beginning to feel the pain.
According to TVP World and other sources, on January 16th, Russia's 2025 oil and gas revenue fell 24% year-over-year. This also fell well short of the Kremlin's adjusted forecast of $110.55 billion, itself a downgrade from the initial $139.8 billion government projection. Final 2025 oil and gas revenue came in around $108.36 billion, about $2 billion below the revised estimate, and over $30 billion short of initial expectations at the year's start. Ukraine's strikes, combined with Western sanctions, cost Russia at least $30 billion in oil and gas revenue in 2025, funds untaxable and unavailable for bolstering military power.
What is unfolding is a convergence of pressures driving Russia's military strength into steady decline. Less money means fewer assets, poorer training, and overall reduced performance. With Putin's war machine receiving less funding, Russian troops die in greater numbers due to inadequate training, armor, and tactics needed to breach Ukrainian defenses. This sets the conditions for Ukraine's forthcoming counteroffensives. Putin has few options to prevent it.
The sole bright spot in Russia's economic catastrophe is domestic inflation easing, according to Moscow itself. The Moscow Times reported on January 16 that Russia's Rosstat statistics agency claimed inflation dropped to about 5.6% in 2025, down sharply from 9.5% in January. But this good news for Russia will not last.
as a value-added tax hike from 20% to 22% will add pressure on household finances and likely reignite inflation, per the report. Ukraine grows stronger. Russia weakens monthly. All Putin has left, according to Mappes and Stepanenko in the New York Post, is propaganda. The authors wrote, "The Kremlin exaggerates the capture of tiny rural settlements along the front line and international borders as major victories, supposedly leading to breakthroughs, something they never achieve. Russia uses misleading flag planting in contested areas, cross-border raids, and staged high-level military meetings to provide visual backing for these lies. Putin is no stranger to falsehoods and crafting his own narratives."
Yet even he cannot argue against the numbers paving the way for a potentially devastating 2026 for Russia if Ukraine avoids the key mistakes from a few years ago, when it launched a counteroffensive to reclaim much of the Donbas now under Russian control. That effort was referenced earlier, and Syrskyi, along with the Ukrainian armed forces, have extracted lessons from the failed attempt to apply in 2026 campaigns. The biggest lesson? Avoid overextension. As Reuters analyzed in a December 2023 article on factors stalling Ukraine's prior summer counteroffensive, Ukraine attempted to bite off more than it could chew.
The counteroffensive stretched across too broad a front. Focus centered on Zaporizhzhia, where analysts then viewed it as the most direct route to sever Russian-held Ukrainian territories. An 80-mile combat axis reportedly ran from Orikhiv through Tokmak to Melitopol, aiming to cut Russian supply lines to Crimea. But Ukraine divided forces across 3 axes, one as far north as Bakhmut in Donetsk, resulting in overextension that caused the effort to unravel. That error will not repeat. What Ukraine prepares for 2026 will differ from 2023. It will more closely resemble the late 2025 counterattacks, albeit on a larger scale. Small settlements will be recaptured. Ukraine will identify weaknesses in Russian lines, largely due to the issues discussed, and exploit them.
Unlike 2023, Ukraine will maintain firm defenses while launching attacks, enabling destruction of poorly protected Russian positions in lightning strikes. Additional advantages exist in 2026 that were absent in 2023. The 2023 counteroffensive was telegraphed months in advance, giving Russia time to prepare. Excessive talk paired with slow action hurt Ukraine, as Moscow fortified. That will not recur in 2026. Syrskyi's comments on streamlining the Ukrainian military exist for a reason. In 2026, counteroffensives will be decided and executed swiftly. Ideally, the slow, ultimately halted gains of 2023 will vanish. Ukraine will strike hard, consolidate, and press on. Russia acts as though prepared for what is coming, but it is not.
Currently, Putin has set an April 2026 deadline to seize the entire Donbas. Frankly, that timeline is unrealistic. Pokrovsk in Donetsk remains out of Russian hands. Even if captured, Moscow must then breach a 31-mile fortified belt west of Donetsk. The BBC reported that the Institute for the Study of War noted Ukraine spent up to 11 years through 2025 fortifying the dangerous belt around these cities. Alongside Pokrovsk, Russia would need to take Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, all within the next 4 months to meet Putin's deadline. That simply will not happen. Russia took roughly 2 years to approach Pokrovsk, and the waiting cities are larger and better fortified against Putin's exhausted forces.
But at least Russia will field new divisions to defend against Ukrainian counteroffensives. As Syrskyi pointed out in the LB.UA interview, Russia plans to form at least 11 divisions in 2026. Yet a problem exists. Russia intended 14 divisions for 2025, but formed no more than half, and even those incomplete. Resources went to offsetting losses, Syrskyi said. In that context, 11 new divisions appear ambitious, especially as Russia loses more troops than it recruits, and Ukraine shifts to the attack. Moscow is unprepared for the storm ahead. And if Ukraine plays its cards right, 2026 could see Russia's meager Donetsk gains reversed, leaving Putin scrambling as the inevitable Donbas collapse torches his entire strategy. Comment number 1 if you support Ukraine, number 2 if you support Russia, and number 3 if you love peace.